Hi, this tutorial is created by pm-prep35.com. pm-prep35.com is a free PMP training website. Do visit pm-prep35.com to access a lot of mock exams, chapter tests and other tutorials. In this session I am going to cover plan stakeholder management process. This process deals with the creation of stakeholder management plan, a subsidiary plan of the project management plan. The stakeholder management plan deals with seeing how stakeholders, the identified stakeholders as created as part of the identify stakeholders process. The list there, it's a list of stakeholders and how these stakeholders will be engaged. What is their current engagement level? What is the desired engagement level? All these things will be tracked, and a strategy to manage the stakeholders will be documented as part of the stakeholder management plan. So with that idea, let's quickly walk through some of the important points of the plan stakeholder management process. So the main point to keep in mind is the stakeholder management plan deals with finding out what is the current engagement level and what is the desired engagement level, and then work towards that direction. Apart from that, any characteristics of a management plan will be covered in the stakeholder management plan, which might be related to how communication or changes about communication will be communicated to the different stakeholders. How will still the engagement will be preserved, because some stakeholder who is really powerful will not be in a position to take easily about any changes, but still how will you convince or how will you ensure that the project goals are still conveyed to them in a proper manner, keeping the engagement level still on intact is what is part of this particular process. The plan stakeholder management process is concerned with coming up with the stakeholder management plan. How different project stakeholders identified as part of initiating process will be handled. The idea here is to ensure that all types of stakeholders are thought over and covered in order to have a viable approach to handle their needs. So as you go down, as part of all the subsidiary plans, the stakeholder management plan takes care of all the processes within the project stakeholder management knowledge area in terms of covering or having a forethought about the different processes in the concerned knowledge area. So it not only puts down what is the stakeholder level, but also to ensure that the engagement is taken, is thought over, and what level it is currently in, how it is decided to be in, and how communication would be done to different stakeholders, what group of stakeholders will be involved in what phase of the project, how they will be communicated, what would be the impacts and how that impact will be handled. All that is part of your stakeholder management plan, stakeholder management process. The main inputs for this process are the project management plan. As with all of the planning process, this is a general input in terms of the fact that the project manager usually starts with an outline plan and develops more specific plans relevant to each knowledge area, because stakeholder management plan is also a subsidiary plan. So you start from your project management plan and build relevant or specific information for the stakeholder management process. Then the second input is the stakeholder register. The stakeholder register is the output of identify stakeholders process. So you take all the stakeholders in part of the stakeholder register, understand their roles, responsibilities, their influence, what is their current engagement level or current understanding of the project, what is their influence. Then from there you build. For example, you have some of the negative stakeholders. How will you keep them engaged in the project? How will you convince them that this project will meet their needs or it's worth the investment? So that kind of information you stakeholder register. The stakeholder register, an output from the identify stakeholders initiating process, has the list of stakeholders who need to be taken care in terms of ensuring that their objectives are prime to the project's success. So you might document all the stakeholders, but then you might want to identify the important stakeholders. Mainly this comes into picture when you have when the project is a result of a procurement from an external organization. So you have to identify who are the powerful stakeholders and who will have the most influence, and then involving them as much to make the project a success. So that's all part of that should all be factored as part of the stakeholder management plan. The next input is the organizational process asset, and then you have the enterprise environmental factors, because most of your planning can reuse the prior experience, as well as it has to factor in the effect of external environment. So that's why these two are common input across all the planning process, that too when you come up with the subsidiary plan. So organizational process assets, as with all planning process, this is an important input to look at lessons learned, processes followed so far, then tailoring guidelines. Enterprise environmental factors, the next input, another vital input for all the planning process, since planning mainly needs to account for external factors affecting the project. So if your project is the result of a procurement, then you have to see who in the external organization play vital role, who will be using it. So you have to factor those users or the stakeholders into your stakeholder management plan. The tools and techniques, like any planning process, expert judgment, the general technique applied in case of planning process, because it's necessary to leverage consultant and senior manager viewpoint here to ensure that the project is covered of all aspects. Moreover, your project has a life cycle and there are different phases, and you need to understand in which phase which group of stakeholders will have the maximum influence on them, and then you have to engage them. You have to have a strategy to manage those groups of stakeholders in the relevant phases. Such things can come out when you have people who have had prior experience in the kind of project you are involved in. Then meetings. Lot of time is spent on meetings during the planning phase, since it is necessary to take the input from various quarters during the planning phase. So you have to involve different stakeholders, and meetings are a good platform to engage them. Then analytical techniques, a usual technique used when developing the plan. The current engagement level and desired engagement level are analyzed. The following are the different engagement levels of the stakeholders. So you need to understand, as part of analysis, you have to understand what are the engagement levels of the stakeholders. So the different types of engagement level are unaware. So you're classifying the stakeholders here, what type of engagement level or what is their exposure or experience in this project. So some of the stakeholders are there is the category called unaware, wherein they are unaware of project and potential impacts. Probably they are first time doing a project in this area, so they need utmost guidance from you or as a project manager, because they need to understand what is the impact of this particular project, how it can change their lives. So that category of stakeholder is called unaware. Then you have resistant, aware of project and potential impacts but resistant to change, mostly tough to handle. So these kind of stakeholders are tough to handle, basically because they probably have used some software or something like that, and they are used to that, and they don't want to have a change in their working style. So that's why they are resistant to the current project. So these people are, you need to account for them, and they are mostly end users. So you need to convince that the project's product will help them do better. Then there is the neutral, neutral stakeholders, aware of project and potential impacts but neutral to change, can be influenced with proper facts. These people, they are not resistant, they are not proactive to take the product, but then they are neutral, but then you need to convince them. So that's the kind of stakeholders when you call them as neutral. Then there is the leading, aware of project and potential impacts. They are fairly excited about the project, so they are sometimes knowledgeable too. Proactive in ensuring that the project is a success, easy to work with. So they are the ones who are driving the project, so they see a lot of value. So these kind of stakeholders, you just need to follow them in terms of what they require and do what they want. So these are the different kinds of stakeholders, and based on this you can make out, like for example, an unaware stakeholder is probably the current engagement level, and you might want to take them to a desired engagement level of being neutral or leading. So that's also the role of your as a project team or a project manager. So the stakeholder management plan is an output of the planned stakeholder management process, has details about how to handle different group of project stakeholders, current and desired engagement levels, communication requirements and communication points. When will you communicate? Probably in different milestones. What will you communicate? What kind of information will you communicate? What is the impact when you communicate certain information, and how will you handle such impacts are all part of your communication management plan. It has the general process as to what other process and stakeholder management knowledge area are applicable and how they will be tailored to the current context, how changes will be handled. So these 2 points are very common across all the planning or all the subsidiary plan development, wherein you tailor the other processes in the knowledge area and see how changes will be handled, how communication about the changes will be handled. Then the other output is a project document updates. Because you are building a plan, you obviously will have impacts to the other objectives. So you can have a risk uncovered, you can have a communication change uncovered. So those might result in project document updates. So let's quickly walk through stakeholder management plan template. If you look at it, the stakeholder management plan here, I wouldn't call this as a full-blown plan, because it is more in line with your stakeholder register, but it has to have additional details in terms of how changes will be communicated, how the engagement will be managed, what communication will be done. All that information should be there part of the stakeholder management plan. But if you see here, it has details about the key stakeholder groups, stakeholder type, then identify the buy-in to the change, how they are going to buy into change, identify the level of influence on the outcome of the project, identify strategies to deal with the resistance. I would rather write a stakeholder management plan wherein you have identified the different groups, you have documented that, then you write strategies for the different groups, and also communication plan for the different groups. What if changes happen, how will you follow? So these would be my sections within my stakeholder management plan, in line with what PMBOK says. Then here is the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. This is useful mainly to understand the current and the desired levels of engagement, because that is one of the important criteria of stakeholder management plan, to see what is the current engagement level, what is the desired engagement level, and what is strategy to move from the current to the desired. See, for example, if you want to make them supportive and they are currently resistant, you will have to have a strategy in place to how to get them to that level. So that is what is the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix all about. So the stakeholder management plan deals with seeing who are the different stakeholders identified as part of the stakeholder list, then having a strategy to deal with them, grouping them, having a strategy to deal with them, and how to communicate project decisions at different points, how to handle communication if there is any friction in terms of sending sensitive information, how will that be handled. So how will you communicate changes and what impact can it have, how will you go about handling things smoothly. So these are all part of your stakeholder management plan. So with that idea, the stakeholder management plan, stakeholder management process is over. So do visit pm-prep35.com to access other process tutorials, mock exams and chapter and tests. Thank you.